So my presentation will have three parts. Part one has been largely already covered by Ram Manohar. And so I'll have very limited remarks on that part one. The part one is Ayurveda today. The part two has also been partly covered by Ram Manohar, which is the history of Ayurveda in the past. And part three will be about the future as I visualize it. So, starting with the part one, we are all aware, and the last presentation has also brought it to your notice, that despite its roots, which go back, over 3 millennia, Ayurveda is a functional knowledge system of health, science, and practice today. And so, beyond the 18th century, up to which Dharampalji documented, even in this 21st century, Ayurveda continues to be a living tradition. The size of the Ayurvedic sector in the private space is estimated to be of the order of 100,000 crore turnover per year. That's pretty large. I mean, 100,000 turnover per year is in terms of manufacturing, in terms of health services, and in terms of investments in education. All this is in the private space. This is recently an estimate that I heard from the CII, the Confederation of Indian Industry, a few weeks ago. That's the size of the sector, and that's pretty large, because the size of the modern sector would be around double that, but this is about 50%. This is in the private sector. In the government sector, of course, the investment into Indian health sciences is rather low in comparison with the investment in the health sector from the government. 97% of the national health budget goes into Western medicine even today, and around 3% goes into the Indian systems. And although in absolute terms, the size of the so-called Ayush sector has been growing, and maybe today of the order of 2,500 crore or so per year, so around 10,000-12,000 crores over a 5-year period, which is much higher than what it was even a decade ago, when over a 5-year period government investments were of the order of less than 2,000 crore over a 5-year period. Today, over a 5-year period, it is around 12,000 crore. But yet, in absolute terms, the government investments have gone up. But as a percentage of the national health budget, they still remain of the order of 3% or so. The private sector investment is much higher, which I indicated. What is Ayurveda doing today? You can get a clear picture of it if you analyze, because 100,000 crore per year is a very large sum of investment in services, in manufacturing, in education. If we analyze the hospital management information systems across the country, and look at the data of what is it that a growing number of people are coming to Ayurveda for, you will get a picture of what is it that Ayurveda is currently, today, in the 21st century, dealing with. You will get that picture of, health-seeking behavior towards Ayurveda. And probably what you will see is that while it is well known that Ayurveda performs competently in the management of chronic conditions, so-called non-communicable diseases, what this data will show you is that surprisingly, this notion that Ayurveda cannot deal with infection is probably not true. I mean, you can see right now in the COVID situation itself, there are enough reports and accounts of a condition which is caused from the point of view of Western medicine by a virus. It certainly is involving a virus, is managed the Ayurveda system without any antivirals. It is managed in terms of Ayurveda's own theoretical framework. But the point I'm making is that here is an infectious condition that is being managed in a relatively competent way. And there are several other infectious conditions that if you look at the hospital information from across reputed hospitals all over the country, you will see that there are a number of other infectious conditions, from simple conditions like diarrhea to viral like herpes or urinary tract infections, which are supposed to be caused by bacteria, all of them being, or wounds, very, very serious wounds that need amputation, that serious, are all being managed without any antibiotics. So it's a myth I'm beginning to see, just based on data available, that Ayurveda cannot deal with infection. So here is a functional knowledge system in the 21st century with growing investments, 100,000 crore per year, managing a wide range of conditions. Certainly, it cannot manage very easily acute and emergency conditions. Certainly, today, it is not managing surgical conditions except in a very small, anorectal region. But in medicine, when I say medicine, I mean not surgery. It's handling a very wide range of conditions, and far wider a range than what we imagine that it is doing. I mean, this is data that will tell you this. Ram Manohar referred to TKDL. That's the Traditional Knowledge Digital Library. That's another source of contemporary information. You have over 300,000 formulations for a wide range of conditions, the kind of conditions that hospital information systems will show you Ayurveda is dealing with. But you have 300,000 formulations computerized, referenced in TKDL, which is the largest computerization effort because it's been backed by CSIR funding. And, when you say there are 300,000 referenced, documented formulations, you can compare it with the entire corpus of drugs that are there in the world market or in the modern pharmacopoeia. And that is of the range of around 4,000. So as against 4,000 drugs that you will find in the global pharmacopoeia of modern drugs, so to say, you have this large number of formulations that TKDL has actually computerized. Of course, for the present, the question remains, and Ram raised it, and I will address it a little in a similar fashion, but a little differently. The question being asked all the time is this knowledge system scientific? I believe that this question has underlying cultural biases. Clearly, it is not scientific in the sense of its foundations. Ayurveda was not discovered by the scientific method. Its perspective is not molecular or cellular. It is a systemic perspective. Its worldview is based on Padharth Vignan, is based on Sankhya, Yoga, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, etc. Its methods of observation are quite different from the methods of observation of modern science. Its scheme of classification is also very different. The way it classifies the diversity of health and disease conditions. And of course, its strategies for modulation of the change that is taking place in health conditions, its strategy for modulation of these conditions is also very different. So in that sense, it is not scientific in the Western, modern Western meaning of science. And yet, of course, there is a great deal of scope for what I would call intercultural, cross-cultural, transdisciplinary dialogue with modern science. There certainly is scope, but the purpose of this dialogue is not, as pointed out by the previous speaker, is not validation. The purpose of dialogue with science is certainly not validation. The purpose is communication, intercultural communication. The purpose could also be, and we are seeing that is the case, could also be innovation. There are a lot of innovation can take place by transfusion of knowledge. We see that fusion of knowledge across cultures can lead to a great deal of innovation in so many domains. It need not only be in medicine, it could be in mathematics, it could be in music, it could be in a whole range of domains. And the history of, world civilization. I mean, we saw in the morning session, MD Srinivas point out that, theoreticians of Jyotish Shastra, of astronomy, and mathematics, even in this period, 14 to 17th, 18th century, were looking at work being done in the Islamic tradition, in the European tradition, and so on and so forth. And so intercultural dialogue is most welcome, is very important, is very useful, is part of, a global civilizational process. But Ayurveda's dialogue with modern medicine or modern biology is not for the purpose of validation, but for the purposes that I mentioned. Finally, on this part one, I would raise a question. We are aware that the foundational texts of Ayurveda are still those texts that were written, in a BC period, the Charak Samhita, the Shushruta Samhita, and so on and so forth. They are the texts that are even today foundational texts. Of course, there was not time, and so Ram Manohar didn't elaborate on the structure of the knowledge in terms of Tattva, Shastra, Vyavhar, etc. But the question that arises that here is an evolving knowledge system with the same foundational texts that were written so far back. And so it raises a question which is very important for all of us to understand as to what is the relationship between knowledge and time. Is knowledge a function of time? Apparently, in the Western sense of progression of knowledge, It is not a function of time. If it were a function of time, we would say that, how can something written 1500, 3000 BC have contemporary relevance and serve as a foundation for the 21st century? But it does. Not all of it, perhaps the so-called Tattva, Shastra, etc. But it does serve as a foundation, and therefore it looks like we need to revisit our understanding of the function of knowledge as a function of time. It looks like knowledge is more a function of how we look at nature, our proximity to nature, the way in which we study nature. And this is a very fundamental difference between Ayurveda and modern science, that we observe nature based on a framework which is implied in Sankhya, as against the modern way of looking at nature, which is in the observer-observed framework, where we separate the observer from the observed. And so the point I'm making is that it's a question. I don't know all the answers to this question, but the question I'm saying is, certainly, knowledge is not a function of time. Knowledge appears to be more a function of your relationship with nature, how you look at nature. If you distance yourself from nature, the more you distance yourself from nature, the more your knowledge is likely to be fragmented and reduced and partial. If you are, so to say, one with nature, whatever that means, then it looks like time is not the factor that is going to diminish your understanding of nature. The final point before starting on part 2 is that it is my view that today, while Ayurveda is undoubtedly growing, and although state investments or government investments are unjustifiably low, 3% of the national health budget, but it is growing in the private sector. And so really it is not government which is giving direction to the growth of Ayurveda. It is the private sector, it is industry, it is the private health services. They are the ones who are giving direction. And the growth is enormous, 100,000 crore turnover per year. So despite the growth, I believe that today I would say the community of health professionals, including the Ayurvedic community, but it's not, Ayurvedic community, please remember, are the carriers of this tradition. They are not the owners of this tradition. The owners of this tradition are all Indians, or all people who belong to this civilizational heritage, to the heritage that Dharampal spoke about, that, Dharampal sensitized us. We are the owners. The carriers are, of course, very special people because they carry the knowledge. So despite its growth, my view is that today Ayurveda is not growing in a bold enough manner. It does not have a sufficiently strategic vision to impact this country or to impact the world. And I'll speak more about it now in part 2 of my presentation. And I request Ankur to quickly start my second slide.
Yes, sir.
So now we do have a history. We can't live on the glory of the past. Certainly Ayurveda is not living on the glory of the past. It's unlike areas like mathematics or astrology or, astronomy rather, and so many other fields, metallurgy. It did not stagnate. Ayurveda has not stagnated. It's a functional, growing knowledge system, but it's not going in a very strategic direction. And while we need not live on the glory of the past, nevertheless, we do appear to have a track record in the past of global impact. Next slide, please. Yes. So now part of this was covered by Ram Manohar. But you can see that, around the, 628 BCE, there was a relationship between India and distant Persia. This is not from a scientific paper, but as reported by the Kanchi Mutt, by the former Perival of Kanchi Mutt, who was a scholar. He testified, in fact, that the Zen Avastha of the Zoroastrians, the pre-Islamic, the Zen Avastha was in fact the Chandogya Upanishad in the Avestan language. So it appears that the relationship between India and Persia, and this is of course in the region of, in the area of Upanishadic knowledge, etc., but it could extend to other domains as well. And of course, even previous to Alexander and the Greeks, the first export of Ayurveda happened during the reign of the Persian Empire, Darius and Cyrus, and which extended from Greece to Sindh, that empire, the Achaemenian Empire. And physicians from here went to Persia, and from Persia to Greece, because the empire extended throughout this region. Centuries later, Alexander invaded India. He too took physicians to Greece. There is no systematic study done about this, but it would appear that the so-called humoral theory of the Greeks had its roots in Ayurveda, because there is just so much of striking similarity. And if you look at the literature that is today available, for example, in the Burrow Wellcome Library, you will see an entire treatise on what we would call in Ayurveda Vat Vichar, but what is translated there as a theory of breath. There's an entire treatise on theory of breath in the library of Burrow Wellcome, and that's of that Greek time. So I believe that the humoral theory of the Greeks had roots in Ayurveda. Please carry on. Next slide. The first spread of Ayurveda to the Middle East, of course, took place through the Roman physician Galen, who took that humoral theory to the Middle East. Subsequently, there were further encounters with the Middle East, but it first went through Galen, apparently, that's the record, from Greece to the Middle East, from Europe to the Middle East. Ram Manohar talks of earlier periods than 11th and 12th century, 8th century AD, perhaps, when there were translation, but there were also during this period, translation of Ayurvedic texts into Arabic. There is the Book of Races, etc. There's huge amount of trade, in any case, that was happening with the West of herbals and with the Middle East as well as with Europe. In fact, the humoral theory is recorded to be influencing psychology in European medicine right up to the 17th century. And you get records of that, references of that. Of course, in the 18th century, we know from Dharampal's work about the spread of plastic surgery from India to Britain, and from there to Europe. And of course, Ram Manohar has talked about it, so I won't elaborate very much on it, that post 18th century, during the colonial period, there is a whole lot of works primarily focused on medicinal plants, where the European curiosity in Ayurveda continued. Of course, I would like to point out that these works on medicinal plants were, in some sense, relatively superficial understanding of Ayurveda. I happen to have in our library, for example, all the 12 volumes of Hortus Malabaricus, and you can try this out yourself. Just flip a page randomly. What you see is that Hortus Malabaricus, as an example, is a great work of botanical art, It is certainly not a source of authentic, reliable, deep knowledge of Indian health traditions to Holland or to Europe. Because if you see the information about the uses of plants, it's very, very superficial in comparison to the knowledge that was actually prevalent in that century. I won't elaborate more on it. I leave this for you to examine. But I'm saying these works looked at our knowledge only at a very relatively superficial level, the post 18th century colonial encounters. So the track record of Ayurveda in this slide, what I'm trying to put across is that we do have a historical track record of global contribution. This, what I have narrated thus far, is the track record of global contribution westwards. That means towards Greece, Europe, the Middle East, and so on and so forth. This encounter was not very, very deep, despite its history from the 5th century or earlier, BCE, right up to the 17th century, probably because of the distance between these regions. A much more powerful impact that Ayurveda had was on the eastern side, on the Asian side. Next slide, please. Here you can see, and I'm just summarizing this in just one slide, that right from the 5th century BC, from the time of Gautam Buddha, via in fact the Buddhist route, Ayurveda spread to China, Japan, Indonesia, Vietnam, Mongolia, Burma, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Tibet. Yes, indeed, you have medical manuscripts of Ayurveda in China. You certainly have them in Mongolia, in Burma, in Thailand, in Lanka, in Tibet. And here the impact of Ayurveda was much deeper, and it continues to this date. Because here Ayurveda spread, got assimilated fully, and you can see the functionality of all the Asian traditional systems of medicine, which were indeed influenced by Ayurveda, the traditional Chinese system. Yes, maybe the interactions were two-way, but my understanding is, and this requires more scholarly study, that really it was from the Buddhist route. I happened to be in China about 15 years ago, and I entered into the Chinese Academy of Traditional Medicine, and I was talking to the head of the Chinese Department of Ophthalmology, and I said, what is the literature that you read to teach ophthalmology? And he picked up a thick, fat book written in Chinese. And I said, can you please read the introduction? And this was a professor, it was not a politician. And the professor read out, and he said that during the Ming dynasty, the emperor of China sent physicians to India, and this book on ophthalmology, a Chinese traditional text on ophthalmology, is largely based on what these people learned, during that visit to India. So I'm just saying that, of course, I'm sure it must have been two-way, etc. But there was a strong, very strong influence of Ayurveda in the East. So in history of Ayurveda's global impact, we don't distinguish between its spread in the West and the East. They are two different things. The Western encounter, it certainly spread. Perhaps in the initial years, it had a larger impact, but over the centuries, it's got diluted and was largely trade that was happening, and theories that got distorted, including the humoral theory. Whereas in the East, the impact was much stronger. It continues even to this date that you have functional knowledge systems of traditional health sciences throughout Asia, the examples of which are here on your screen. Next. So what I'm saying is, today Ayurveda is functional, it is growing. It's not a story of where I'm saying we were great in the past. No, we are even very, very functional today and growing. And we have a track record of global contribution in the past, both westwards from Persia and Greek to the Middle East and eastwards throughout. So we have this track record. So that means we should tell ourselves that we have had a global impact. Now the question is that my view is we are not being sufficiently strategic in the way we are visualizing Ayurveda for the 21st century and its global impact. We are not visualizing it in a sufficiently strategic manner, not sufficiently strategic within our own country, not sufficiently strategic outside our country. And in my view, there are three areas in which we need to give strategic directions. And all those three areas are strengths of Ayurveda. The first area in which we need to give strategic direction is surgery. And I'll start with that. So we are aware, this 18th century plastic surgery business is relatively recent, but we are aware that Ayurvedic surgeons were performing all kinds of complex surgeries 3-4 millennia years ago, from brain surgery to eyes, cesarean deliveries and so on and so forth. Now, undoubtedly today, and this happens often in the course of civilizational history, that even though a particular knowledge may go from one culture, get transmitted from one culture to other cultures, and in this case, surgery certainly was transmitted from India, to the rest of the world over the centuries. It can happen that after some time, the parent culture, for whatever reasons, becomes weak. And certainly in the case of surgery, today we need to go to the West in order to learn surgery. They have overtaken us there's no scope anymore for practicing surgery in the way we did centuries ago. But the question is, how are we dealing with surgery in India today? Why is the Indian government, why is the community of health professionals in general, why are the sort of people who are thinking about India and establishing its role, its rightful role, not insisting that we recover our strength in surgery? So I think the first strategic direction for restoring strength to Ayurveda, today Ayurveda is functioning on, let's say, one leg instead of two legs, only on the leg of medicine, not on the leg of surgery. Yes, we lost the advantage of surgery. So what? I mean, these things happen over civilizational history. But today we need a bold strategy to learn from the incredible surgery that is grown, from its transmission to the West, and absorb it into mainstream Ayurveda. If you re-establish proficiency in surgery in Ayurveda, it will be a historical debt being repaid to Ayurveda, but then Ayurveda will stand properly on both its legs instead of one, both on the national and global stage. This is an extremely important step to take. I mean, it is very, very interesting to see that despite standing on one leg, it is growing. But why not make it grow properly on two legs? It's not that, we are wanting to learn. I mean, the world learned surgery from us. Today, we must learn surgery from those who have taken it much beyond what they took from us and strengthen ourselves. If Ayurveda becomes strong, both in medicine and surgery, the entire shape and practice and esteem of Ayurveda will change. It's a very important strategic direction in my view. So this is one strategic direction. We are not addressing this direction at all. And that's why I'm saying that, despite its growth, we are not taking strategic steps. One strategic step is to restore surgery without saying that, we were good surgeons in the past, we no longer are, and so we'll remain impoverished. Why should we think like that? Okay, the next slide.
Excuse me, Darshan Shankar. I just have a quick question to the organizers. We're about 20 minutes behind schedule. I hope the technology won't limit us severely. Do you think we can extend this session beyond 5:30 if there's a need?
Yes, sir. We can definitely extend it, sir.
Thank you, thank you. Please go ahead, Darshan. You've come to the most important part of the presentation, but yeah, please go ahead.
The next strategic direction is in medicine. And in medicine today, we should stop attempting merely to prove. Most of the medical research is happening to merely prove that we are somehow scientific and, in the framework of modern science. We should give up that approach. We should be using our brilliant understanding of the systemic understanding of biological change, which is there in Dosh Vichar. We should be using that brilliance of physiology and collaborating with modern science as equal partners with the most advanced biology. This is the work that Valyathan, seeded 15 years ago, and he called it Ayurvedic biology. And there are areas in Ayurvedic biology that we should address, which can completely change, the face of health services globally. We should be moving into personalized food and medicine. Personalized medicine is a frontier area. There is no way in which this direction of personalized medicine can get sufficient depth or personalized food without collaboration with Ayurveda. I won't go into the detail of it. We have to be looking at a new or refined classification of diseases. The current modern classification of diseases, the international classification, is relatively gross. This is a common experience of Ayurvedic physicians all over the country. You get a person coming with a certain diagnosis from the modern side. Ayurvedic physicians are forced to re-diagnose and classify the person into subtypes because of the variation that is there in the patient. And the treatment is variable because the condition is variable. And of course, the outcomes are better, generally. Now, this business of classification of disease is a global contribution. You can work with advanced biology, you will find biomarkers underlining your scheme of classification in Ayurveda, etc., etc. So classification of disease will be a global contribution. Regenerative biology. I mean, today all regenerative biology is only working on the stem cell model. You have Rasayan Tantra here, which is looking at regeneration of course, tissues, organs, the entire body. It's an entirely different framework. It's not at the cellular level. It's at a systemic level. Regenerative and research that has been initiated by Valyathan and by others working in Pune, even in our own university, show that there's a huge amount of promise in combining regenerative biology of Ayurveda with modern medicine. Multi-targeted drug discovery. This is another very, very important area. I mean, the days of single molecule, single targets is over. That's very simplistic biology. Every single health condition is multifactorial. It requires, multiple targets. And you are sitting in TKDL on 3 lakh drug formulations, which are multi-target, formulations. You have all the biological tools today, like the multi-omics platforms and so on and so forth, to review your drugs and show them as 21st century drugs. The 21st century drugs will not be, single molecules for single targets. They will be for tackling multiple targets, for tackling syndromes. That is 21st century drug discovery. And you are sitting on a knowledge that is, equipped to contribute significantly to do this. And similarly, in the area of bioregulation, I will not elaborate further because of shortage of time, but it's a very key area that Ayurveda's understanding of bioregulation is very, very, very sophisticated. So these are the strategic directions in clinical research, in basic research, not trying to prove, very simple things of your, mostly our work has been in very non-strategic directions. So I end this slide, and that's the last point. I'm saying investment in these areas of surgery, of clinical science and basic biology in areas like the ones I have illustrated, working in the area of wellness science. I won't elaborate too much on it, but today all of healthcare is not healthcare, it is disease care. Every single hospital in the world is only engaged in disease management. Ayurveda understands health. We can create a new health science. We can remove the skew that is there in health practices, or which are all disease oriented. Swasthya is the key word, and I won't again elaborate, but you can create an entire very deep wellness science. So wellness science, surgery, and strategic areas of clinical research, these are the areas in which we should invest, create network of new institutional platforms of excellence, attract the best researchers within the country, attract the best students within the country and outside. Ayurveda can become a global destination for the advancement of health sciences in the 21st century, and this should be our vision.